Thank you for clicking on this video. Welcome back to Rank the Movies. Well, I'm going to do another month of something I want to talk about. This month, the month of April, I want to talk a little bit about franchises. So this is going to be my franchise month. I'm going to talk about various franchises. The definition of a franchise I'm going to keep really simple. It's anything with 4 or more films in it. Most of the things I'll be looking at have far more than 4 movies, and I'll be doing some different things with each franchise and each idea. But I decided to start with the oldest franchise I own, and that is the Universal Classic Monsters. That's right, the 8 classic films that make up Universal's library. Now, there's actually plenty of films. This box set is chock full of like over 30 Universal monster films. I'm going to focus on these 8. The 8 original of the Universal monsters: Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Bride of Frankenstein, The Wolfman, Phantom of the Opera, and Creature from the Black Lagoon. And I'm going to rank these movies only. I'm going to talk a little bit about their series as well. Outside of The Creature from the Black Lagoon, I have watched the rest of the movies featuring the original Universal movie monsters. Here's the thing: some of them get recast and recreated as their series go on. Claude Rains' Invisible Man, Dr. Griffin, is only in the original Invisible Man movie. Same thing with Imhotep, which is Boris Karloff's portrayal of the Mummy. He's only in The Mummy. When it gets to The Hand of the Mummy, Curse of the Mummy, that's a completely different mummy. So I'm only going to be talking about the films involving the original versions of the Universal horror monsters. So, let's get started. So I've got 8 films, so we're going to talk about which one I think is the worst out of all of them, and number 8, Phantom of the Opera. Don't expect this one to be like the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical that everyone would be very familiar with. It's not. It is in Technicolor, which is the only movie made in color of these 8 movies. Even though Creature from the Black Lagoon came out after, it was still not made in color. It was black and white. Phantom of the Opera, it is about a violinist named Claudine who invests heavily in a young singer's future. He is the inspiration for the later Phantom of the Opera because he does end up wearing the mask. He becomes scarred. He haunts the opera. He begins killing people. He covers all the bases that you would see later on in later adaptations of this story. However, this one gives more of a backstory to Claudine that isn't he was born a freak and he lived under the opera house. He was the violinist. He was fired. He had no money because he was secretly supporting a singer's musical career, and he kind of goes insane when he takes his newest work, his great concerto, and he believes wrongfully that it's being stolen from him, that somebody is trying to take it as their own, when in fact they're just playing it going, this is great. He hears it as it's being stolen. So he gets into a huff, gets acid thrown in his face, and is forced to wear the mask. It's a decent Universal horror movie. It's not great. It's by far the weakest out of all of the Universal movie monsters. And that's why it sits in the last spot. So let's move on to the next one on this list, which is Creature from the Black Lagoon. Admittedly, I just watched this movie very recently. It was the last one I watched of these 8 original Universal horror film monsters, only because it interested me the least. It wasn't a bad movie by any means. As I mentioned, this is the last one made, and its entire series, it had 2 sequels. All of them were basically done at the butt end of Universal's original movie monster catalog. But it is an interesting movie. You have people going out to find a fossilized hand of a creature that is the Creature from the Black Lagoon's ancestor, fossilized. They start digging around for it. They find the Black Lagoon. They find the creature. The creature shows to be intelligent, quick, and possibly murderous. It might also be because, humans are interacting in his area and are affecting him. The first time he goes on land, it's not 100% sure if he's there to kill the humans or if he's just kind of interested in what's going on, being curious, and he gets a oil-filled lantern thrown at him that was lit, so it kind of lights him on fire, and then he kills the humans. So it's kind of hard to say if he is, a creature who was openly villainous or just a creature protecting himself. It's not a bad movie. Again, it's not the first one I'd start with from Universal. I haven't watched its sequels yet, so I can't tell you anything about if those are good sequels or bad sequels. But it's definitely, this was the end of Universal's original run of horror movie monsters. And, it went out with a bang. It's a very good ending. It is a vast improvement over Phantom of the Opera, which is good. So, now I'm moving into more of the original bunch. There's only one other movie made kind of later in this run, only one other monster. Most of them came out, in the first couple of years of Universal's movie monsters. And this one kind of almost tail-ended it, but was beaten out by only one other, and that is The Invisible Man, starring Claude Rains as Dr. Griffin. Essentially a scientist creates a formula that turns himself invisible. This has already happened at the beginning of the movie. He is already an invisible man. You don't see him transform, he is just invisible. He goes and secludes himself to try to figure out how to undo the effect, make himself visible again. So he goes to a far-off village and he tries his damnedest to turn around what he is and make himself visible so people can actually see him. But being invisible drives him insane. And he continues, and he stops his work, and he starts just basically terrorizing people. An interesting fact of this movie is they make it take place during the winter. And the Invisible Man, if he's not in his bandages and his coat, to actually look invisible, to not be seen by anyone, he has to be naked. So it's basically a naked man running around in the snow, which they bring up. They use it to the effect of the movie, which is really nice. It is a very well done movie. Like I said, Claude Rains' version of Dr. Griffin is only in this one. All the sequels kind of focus on other people who get their hands on the invisibility serum and then become invisible to various degrees of either they become insane and murderous, like The Good Doctor, or they're actually being helpful and are being heroic. I believe there's one Invisible Man film where he ends up, where the Invisible Man is the heroic character and not actually a monster. This movie had an actual remake recently called The Invisible Man. Not great, not awful, just not what I was expecting. And also Hollow Man is another one. It's not a remake of The Invisible Man, but it definitely borrows a lot of information from it, and is a great continuation. If you're looking for a more modernized version of this story, definitely watch Hollow Man. It is good. It is a good retelling of kind of the bare facts of the story. The new Invisible Man, it's a stalker film, so if you want to watch, if you like movies where someone's stalking someone else, it could be good that way, but as far as an interpretation of the H.G. Wells story, it is not. Alright, so we're going to hit the halfway point real quick here, because that's next, halfway point, and that is Dracula. This is the first of the Universal horror movies. This is the one that came out first. It came out the same year as Frankenstein, but Dracula does predate Frankenstein by a couple of months. This is what Bela Lugosi is known for, this and Ed Wood films. But this is what most people will remember Bela Lugosi for. And in fact, if you've never seen this movie, it is worth it just to watch Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi is so good in this movie. It is not, comparing to the other Universal horror movies, movie monsters, it's obviously not the best, but Bela Lugosi might be. I'm ranking the movies here, not the monsters themselves. In that ranking, Dracula would be far higher, only because of the way Lugosi portrayed the character, and the way Lugosi kind of set a standard for how Dracula needs to be portrayed by anyone else who tries to take on that mantle. It is a great job. It is a great movie. Basically, if you've never seen it, the story is actually super simple. Dracula moves into Carfax Abbey. He begins tormenting the daughter and her friend of the sanitarium next door, and they find out he's a vampire. I mean, really, it's a simple plot, it's a simple movie, but it is worth watching. If you like to speak Spanish as well, there is a Spanish version of this movie as well, that actually uses a completely different cast. They shot it at night on the same sets they used to film the English version during the day. So it's really quite interesting. Again, Dracula does have sequels. You have Son of Dracula, Daughter of Dracula, but as those titles tell you, they're Dracula's son and Dracula's daughter are the main characters. Dracula himself would not come back in a Universal horror film until House of Frankenstein, and then the subsequent film House of Dracula. Both do feature the good Count, not played by Bela Lugosi anymore. Lugosi would return to the role one time only for Universal, and that is Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. That is the only time Bela Lugosi would play this role again. And again, it's a highlight of that movie. Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. It's not a bad comedy, but Bela Lugosi is so good in that movie. He is so good in this role. It's kind of a letdown. Not that the actor, I believe his name was Robert Carradine, who took over Dracula in the two House movies. Not that he did a bad job with it, he just isn't Bela Lugosi. And unfortunately, that's what you have to hold him up to, is he Bela Lugosi? So yeah, see it for Lugosi. It's definitely worth it. Alright, so we're over halfway. Now kind of the weird entry in this series, only because it's a sequel of itself. And although I wasn't going to talk about the sequels, this is one of the more popular Universal horror monsters, so it's kind of hard to leave them out because they only appear in a sequel, and that is The Bride of Frankenstein. Who appears in The Bride of Frankenstein? Much like many of these Universal monsters, the name of the movie is the name of the monster. This is the sequel to Frankenstein. I loved Frankenstein. Bride of Frankenstein is really good. It's one of those moments where the sequel almost is as good as the original. The Bride of Frankenstein is only in this one movie as well. The rest of the library of Frankenstein movies do not feature the bride. And she's only in like the last 20-ish minutes of the movie, and I'm really being liberal with that, given the fact the movie is only like an hour and 15 minutes. It might even be shorter than that. These Universal movies are not long by any stretch of the imagination. The longest one is an hour and a half. And that seems like it takes forever because they have a really good story structure in these movies that makes them short, but you feel like you get the full meal of a story you'd get today. So when they had an hour and a half movie, it felt like it took forever to get there. And that's actually one of the Frankenstein movies that runs the hour and a half. The Bride of Frankenstein, it's a good movie. Again, talking about the movie, it's a great movie. If I was talking about the monster, this one would have been at the bottom of the list. Again, the bride only shows up at the tail end of the movie. She doesn't do much, and, it's just that she was the titled monster, and it's the female monster, and so that's where that popularity comes from. But overall, she's not really there. The movie is really good, though. It continues off for Frankenstein, leaves off with Dr. Frankenstein being brought in by another doctor to create a bride for Frankenstein, a mate, someone that Frankenstein can actually relate to. Frankenstein doesn't want to create a monster bride for his monster. I'm referring to both Dr. Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster as Frankenstein, so I'm sorry if this is confusing. But he doesn't want to create the bride. He wants to just be done with it and move on with his life. And, be with his wife, have children, which will be relevant in the sequels. And that's what he wants to do. However, he just keeps getting pulled in until he finally says yes, and he creates his monster, a bride. And the bride doesn't want Frankenstein, and crap goes sideways. That's how this movie plays out. It is a good movie. It's worth watching, especially if you're about to sit down to watch Frankenstein. Just make it a double feature. Watch Bride of Frankenstein. Literally, it'll take up like 2.5 hours of your life. That's an Avengers movie right there, and you could watch these two movies. So, just do it. It's worth it. Especially when you see what Frankenstein lands on this list. Alright, now that I'm through with The Bride of Frankenstein, I'm going to talk about my all-time favorite Universal movie monster next. It is my favorite by far. It's not my favorite movie after I sat down and watched them all, but it's still my favorite monster, and that's the Wolfman. The Wolfman came out very late. It only precedes Phantom of the Opera and Creature from the Black Lagoon of the original 8, although he is definitely held up there higher than a lot of those other monsters. He came out very late. He was the 6th monster of 8 to be premiered by Universal, which, again, that's a late entry into this line of thought. Of course, he was played by Lon Chaney. Lon Chaney always played the Wolfman, and every incarnation of the Wolfman, Lon Chaney also played Dracula. No, I'm sorry, not Dracula, Frankenstein. Lon Chaney played Frankenstein in some of the Frankenstein sequels as well. The movie also, oddly enough, features Bela Lugosi as the werewolf that bites Lon Chaney. Also, Bela Lugosi would go on to play Frankenstein in Frankenstein Meets the Werewolf. Bela Lugosi did play Dracula, a werewolf, and Frankenstein, all for Universal. This is a fun little tidbit I want to throw in here. But anyways, the Wolfman, Lon Chaney, he goes home to basically, his brother has died, he's going home to take over the castle for when his father passes. He meets a woman, they go out to see a gypsy, and he gets bitten by a wolfman, played by Bela Lugosi. He kills the wolfman and himself begins to transform into a wolfman. This story actually is kind of interesting because they play it off that no one's 100% sure if he's actually turning into the wolfman or if it's just his mind playing tricks on him. Though you see the physical transformation and you physically see him as the wolfman throughout this movie, again, it's still that question of, is it really him transforming into this creature, or is it just his mind screwing with him? Lon Chaney does a great job as the Wolfman in all of the movies, because he's in this one. His other movies, oddly enough, all you have to do is watch the Frankenstein series, and you'll watch all the Wolfman movies minus the original, because his next appearance is Frankenstein versus the Wolfman, or meets the Wolfman, then House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. He has 5 movies, 4 of which have Frankenstein, 3 of which have Dracula. But it's always Lon Chaney. Lon Chaney is always the guy putting on that makeup. So, I mean, he made a good career out of it, and it is an interesting movie. And I've always loved the idea of the Wolfman and the story of the Wolfman. So it's an endearing story, and I like the fact that it's always this Wolfman. He dies at the end of this movie, spoiler alert, but he's brought back in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and it's still this version of the Wolfman. It hasn't changed. He is brought back to life by the full moon, because the Lycanism is just in him now. And so the full moon just brings that out of him, regardless of, death or life. And really, his struggle for the remainder of the Wolfman series of movies is simply, how can I die? He's a very sad character, and that's why I love Lon Chaney as the Wolfman, and I love Wolfman. He's one of my favorite monsters. Alright, moving on to my number 2 favorite Universal movie monster film. This one took me by surprise that I liked it so much. I wasn't certain how I was going to feel about it, and after I watched it, I really understood why it's gotten so many remakes. And that's Boris Karloff's The Mummy. Boris Karloff plays Imhotep. That name's ringing a bell because of the Brendan Fraser Mummy movies. That's because it's a remake of this movie. It's a spiritual remake. It's not an actual remake. They still keep Imhotep, but most of the other story is kind of glossed over. Imhotep is discovered, awakened, and goes off to start a new life as a ex-mummified zombie, basically, who still has powers and mental capacity to talk. He meets a woman who reminds him of the reincarnation of his lost love, and he tries to get back together with her, only to eventually be destroyed. It's a very interesting movie. It's a very well done movie. Boris Karloff is so good in this role, and it shows his range, because he's also Frankenstein, but Frankenstein doesn't say a hell of a lot, but the Mummy does. He's very, Imhotep is very articulate, and it kind of shows Boris Karloff's range. Like I said, they do have other Mummy movies that came out after this, but it was no longer Imhotep as the Mummy. They moved on to a different Mummy. I believe the Mummy's name was Caius. I'm almost certain I'm absolutely wrong on that name, but I believe but that is the Mummy they move on to. So basically, this is a all-encompassing, and Imhotep is all-encompassed in this one movie. I mean, it's such a good movie. I get why, they remade it in the 90s with Brendan Fraser and those versions of the movie, which I also really enjoy. And then the questionable idea of the Tom Cruise movie came out. So, you at least got a couple really good movies off of this idea of Imhotep. It is good. I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed it. when I sat down to watch it. Alright, so that brings us to the number one. If you've been doing a tally list or paying attention, then you know. Number one has to be Frankenstein. Ta-da! Frankenstein. Frankenstein is... It's a classic. It's the second Universal movie monster to come out. Mummy is the third, by the way, in case you're trying to do a timeline. It goes... if you go back to the beginning of the video, that image I show with all the posters lined up, that is the release order of those movies. He is the second. He came out the same year as Frankenstein, or Dracula, only a couple of months later. Basically, you have the story of Dr. Henry Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein is actually the doctor from the novel, not the doctor from the movie. They gave him the name Henry for the movie, which was the name of his friend. It's weird. Dr. Henry Frankenstein creates a monster. He gives it life, and the monster begins to run wild. It ends with a great scene at a windmill, and it's a classic. I mean, it's hard to describe these movies because they have very narrow plots in them. Like, you have Frankenstein, he creates his monster, he tries to teach his monster, and then his monster escapes. And then it wreaks havoc until the conclusion of the movie. Again, these aren't long movies, they don't have huge dynamic plots. But, I mean, Frankenstein himself, as I finally grab this thing as I'm talking, Frankenstein also has the largest library of movies, as he was in films from 1931 to 1948. And that adds up to a good deal of films. He's got 8. He's got 8 movies here. He's got as many movies as there are Universal movie monsters. And, I mean, yes, his final 4 are those crossover films, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, where he's played by Bela Lugosi, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Those are his last 4 movies that he came out with, but he has Bride of Frankenstein, which we talked about, Son of Frankenstein, and Ghost of Frankenstein, which continue the Frankenstein story. In fact, the story is pretty much continued straight through 7 of the 8 films, with Abbott and Costello meeting Frankenstein, being the lonely loser out there. That really doesn't connect, but I mean, doesn't have to. So Frankenstein, he has a long history of it, and Son of Frankenstein and Ghost of Frankenstein is where you can see Lon Chaney do the role. It is a great movie. It is definitely the series is worth watching. I sat down with each one of these films, and they're all very good. They're all spectacular films. In fact, this box set I have is just a great box set. Like I said, it's got 30 different Universal movie monsters spread out over the 8 monsters that Universal has. So it's got 7 of these box sets. The one thing I'm going to point out, just because I feel like pointing it out, is that here's the Wolfman set, the Dracula set, and the Frankenstein set. Between these three sets, I have 3 copies of each movie of House of Dracula, House of Frankenstein, and Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, because they're in each one of these sets. Which just means I have options of which version I want to watch. So that is kind of the downside, is it's 30 different movies. It is 30 movies spread out over this entire set. But you kind of lose a little because, yeah, you got 30 different movies, but then you also got repeats in there as well. But this is a cool set. If you are really interested in the Universal movie monsters and you want to see a lot of what they offered in their original, I mean, this one even has Werewolf Women of London in it, which is the original werewolf movie they did, but it didn't feature the Wolfman, it just had werewolves in it. And I believe it also has one other oddball in here, but otherwise you get the Invisible Man movies, all of them that came out, all 3 creature movies, the Mummy, and all of the other Mummy movies. It's a good set to have. I'm glad I bought it. But anyways, so this is my first installment of Franchise Month. We talked about the 8 original Universal horror movie monsters. Next week, I'm going to talk about my favorite slasher film series. So come back, tune in. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to make sure you definitely see what I'm doing. Hit the like button to like this video, give it a thumbs up. And check back later, because next week, talking about my favorite horror series. Should be fun. See you then.